Hi everyone, happy to be here. My name is Artem Kotelskiy, and I'm going to be talking about this paper of maximum viable security, and it's really a framework for how to think about Ethereum issuance, and it's a work in collaboration with ADCV, Danny McNutt, and Sonia Kim from Stakehouse. Maybe I'll give just a little bit of background because I'm kind of newish to crypto research scene. I have been mathematician for about 10 years, studied topology and geometry, pure mathematics. And yeah, over like past 6 years, I've been slowly sort of transitioning to crypto research. And I work at Cyberfund, right? And Cyberfund is an investment firm, and it's founder-led. And the most important thing about it is that we try to accelerate transition of our economy to cyber economy. And by cyber economy, I mean an open, efficient cyber economy where everyone on the planet can collaborate, right? And the reason why we're so focused on crypto is because crypto and blockchains is a value substrate on top of which this cyber economy can be built. Quick disclaimer, Cyberfund holds ETH, LDO, and is investor in P2P. So what are we trying to do in general about Ethereum issuance policy? I think pretty much the goal is clear. We want to develop a stable, sustainable issuance policy. And I wanted to take a step back a little bit and think, okay, what could that really mean? And I came up with these 4 simple steps. And the first one is set the North Star and have a guiding framework. Second is collect the necessary data. Third is analyze scenarios individually. And fourth is analyze scenarios relative to each other. And I would argue that we largely have been focused on number 3, research led by Ethereum Foundation. But I think all other 3s, 1, 2, and 4, are also very, very important. And basically those 4 steps is the plan for my talk. So let's talk about North Star and framework. So first, why do we need a high-level framework? Well, the first thing is that it's an incredibly complex topic with many, many factors, right? So we need to kind of find our way through all these factors. And second, it's very contentious. So we need to rally people around a direction. So that's basically, and it's almost, in my mind, it's almost unavoidable. If we want to come to a rough consensus, right, we need some sort of North Star and framework which will guide us and which will help us agree on something. Next is how. How do we find this North Star? What to optimize for? This one is big, by the way, for me. I think we need to spend like a lot of time talking about this, what to optimize for. There's 3 things I think that are floating around. One is network, Ethereum, right? Another is asset, ETH. And a third one, stakers, interestingly, right? And I would argue that the framework and proposals that have been suggested by Ethereum Foundation, MVI stake cap, are largely focused on the asset ETH, while our framework, maximum viable security, actually is more focused on network. And this is basically the starting point of our paper, is that actually the network is the most important. And it's not to say that ETH is not important or stakers are not important, but it's important to understand that the value flows from network to asset, primarily. Of course, there is some value from the asset to network as well, but primarily value flows from network to asset. And also about the stakers, this one is you know, we all really love stakers, right? And especially solo stakers because they bring most decentralization. But let's think about why we love stakers. And we are stakers by ourselves, so we love ourselves as well. Well, the reason is because they secure Ethereum, right? It's not just by default we love them, right? So when arguing about Ethereum issuance, we cannot think about stakers without thinking Ethereum network. We always need to have this in mind. So we cannot just build something that is good for stakers, because stakers are providers of security for the network. And I strongly feel that, and I strongly feel a little bit of confusion in the community that, you know, we serve stakers, we like all our conversation about stakers, but they are about stakers because they give us something, right? So we need to ground ourselves in the root cause, which is the network. And I'll come to that later, of course. And so what should be the framework? Well, I would argue, and I think most of people agree actually, that the network's highest value that it brings to the table, Ethereum's biggest value proposition, is security and neutrality. So now, if we take security and neutrality as a framework, and I think there's a large consensus that that's the network's biggest differentiator. What should we think about? Well, we need to think about attacks, and there's three types. There's more, but these are three main types of attacks. If actor has 34% of network, it can double sign. And this attack is interesting because it is seen by protocol. Protocol can detect it, and there is automatic slashing there. 51% attacks are trickier because you can do short reorgs, you can also censor, and these attacks, they are not seen by the protocol. And gradual coercion by state actors is an attack that we didn't really see, but it's very possible we see it, and it is also not seen by the protocol. And I would argue that Ethereum's autonomy, it's a concept that Gabe Shapiro came up with, ability to resist these attacks that are not seen by the protocol is a very important thing to think about, right? Because if we don't defend against these attacks in some other way, not in protocol, but out of protocol, we are vulnerable. So what are the defenses? Well, as I said, there's cryptographic slashing for A, there is social slashing for A and B, but it's pretty politically messy to do. And also, like, if we want to automate it, there are ways to do it to some extent, but it's very complicated, and you cannot do it fully, right? That's why protocol doesn't see it. And I would argue that, you know, the core defense that Ethereum has against actually all these attacks is the decentralization that comes from distributed validator set, ensuring that no single party controls any of the big thresholds of network. And this defense is preventive, it's apparent, it's Ethereum's biggest differentiator. If you think about other networks, Ethereum has the most diverse validator set by far. And I would also stress that it is key to neutrality. Okay? Neutrality comes from this fact. So I would argue we need to think about intentionally about this defense mechanism. And so the upshot of framework is that we suggest this MVS framework, maximum viable security and neutrality, and it largely comes from geographically distributed and disconnected validators. And if I were to contrast this with the framework of MVI, MVS strives to maximize security. Of course, you cannot forget about asset, you cannot forget about stakers, so without compromising the rest, for example, scarcity of ETH. And MVI is the opposite. It minimizes issues, prioritizes assets without compromising, trying to not compromise security. And maybe a slightly different way of to think about it is that MVS prioritizes expansion of the network and sustainability, right, over efficiency, and MVI does the opposite. Okay, coming to the second point of the plan is the data collection, right? And this is what I wanted to focus a little bit on because there's basically a whole staking economy built around Ethereum staking, and I wanted to maybe talk a little bit in detail about it. So first, what types of stakers there are? Well, obviously there are solo stakers, and they have actually about 10% of the market, give or take. On-chain techies, so these are people who are on-chain and basically on-chain, but without really sort of big restrictions, big regulatory restrictions or something like that. And then institutions, they're also on-chain, but they come with their own sort of restrictions and preferences. There's retail, and then there's ETFs, which are not there yet, but they're coming. And we saw yesterday that ETF issuer actually acquired a testant, so we know they're coming. So now the next point, and this is probably the most important point that I want to convey, is that the majority of the staking market, 90%, works through delegation. There's no way around it. That's how the market works. And we need to think about this intentionally, and we need to, I feel like we need to almost accept it, because most of the talk is about solo stakers, and of course we want to support them, right? But we really need to think how Ethereum issuance will affect delegated stake. So what are the types of delegation? So first is centralized exchanges. They have 20% of the market. And 15%, by the way, is by Coinbase. And they charge a quarter, there are different fees, but roughly they charge actually 25%, a really high fee. Why they charge this high fee is because their users are sticky, right? They don't want to go on chain, and they just want convenience, okay? And as a result, there's very big sort of network effects there, economies of scale, and it's a really not competitive market, and it is fairly concentrated within Coinbase and Binance. Next come centralized staking providers. So these are first like P2P, Kiln, Figment, and these are, interestingly, it's a different market segment from centralized exchanges. They serve institutions a lot, they serve on-chain techies, and they charge way less fees, 1 to 5%. Why? It's a very competitive market. Okay, there's many of those. And because it's a competitive market, it is decentralized. So these are two sort of, let's say, straightforward way to delegate stake, right? And then there's one which is trickier, which we'll know is these decentralized pools, liquid staking token pools, and liquid restaking token pools, like Lido, EtherFi, Rocket Pool, etc. So these are, it's important to understand that these do not really run node operators. They do not validate Ethereum. They are middleware that take stake primarily from on-chain techies, and they distribute this stake into various validated nodes. So, for example, some distributed to solo stakers like Rocket Pool or Lido with their community staking module, but majority actually is distributed into centralized staking providers. And the core point is this, I have these 3 arrows here, 3 arrows here, is because it really distributes it uniformly, which actually brings a lot of decentralization to Ethereum. So, and that's sort of one reason why it exists, and the other reason is because they provide also liquidity. So you can notice that they charge roughly 10%. There's different fees. And the reason why it's higher than centralized staking providers is because people who stake with LST and LRT pools, they get liquidity, right? And so they can get DeFi yield on top. So that's the market structure, right? And pools have 40%, centralized staking providers 25%, and centralized exchanges 25%. Okay? All right. So I want to stress one other thing about this these markets. I'll speed up a little bit. That actually, I feel like the market, the staking market, is kind of subtle. It's not straightforward. It is actually segmented. It is segmented into centralized exchanges with very sticky customers who are inelastic to yield, essentially. I'm not even sure they know the yield. They just think that they know that they're staking and they're earning something, but they don't really care, like, is it 2, 2.5, 1%, or something like that, right? And then on-chain segment with CSPs, LSTs, and LRTs, and solo stakers, where we have sophisticated participants who actually kind of go between each other. And I would, a lot of arguments in the research, they sort of at some point say, well, it's a competitive market, so the margins will compress either way. I personally don't think so, and I do not, and I think we need to try to, let's say, really segment this market. The reason why is because if the market is not segmented and margins compress, we do not have hope for decentralization. Centralized delegated staking is way cheaper and superior. So if it's all hyper-competitive, there's no chance to decentralize the stake. So we really need to find a way how we're going to distribute the stake among many participants. And this is, I think, one natural way as it happens. And the natural way is that sticky customers who are willing to pay 25% fees with centralized exchange, they stay there. And centralized exchanges, their optimal solution is to not lower the fees, not compete with on-chain segment. Their optimal solution is to charge higher fees. You can think of this as pension funds. Pension funds, you know, even though they seem to not charge really high fees, but if you dig down into the mechanism, they actually do charge high fees. It's because their users are extremely sticky. Okay, so I feel like it's an important message. Of course, I mean, there's a lot of analysis needs to be done here on the costs, on the fees, on the stake elasticity, but that's how I feel right now. And we at Cyberfund have a grants program, MBI grants program, where various teams dig into all this. And so watch out for the announcements of various reports that we're going to publish. Okay, so analysis of the impact, right? So from what I told you, what do we think will happen if we cut the issues? Well, as I said, the stakers are sophisticated with LST, LRT, and CSPs. And so as a result, you know, their yield will be lowered, and they will churn. And so the decentralized market segment actually decreases. Centralized exchange stakers are inelastic, and so they largely don't churn, and actually that results in centralized exchanges gaining market share. And solo stakers will churn, and you know, as Ansgar and Kaspar said, potentially at a lower rate, right? Because they have very diverse costs and preferences. However, we also analyze in our paper their cost structure, and actually they have really high costs, high fixed costs, and they're very inflexible. So their supply curve is maybe steep marginally, but I think it's very low, kind of at the lower end of yields. So at some point, actually, there will be a big cliff, a big jump, a big drop of solo stakers. So we need to really be careful, right, about solo stakers. And by the way, the amount of solo stakers will decrease, and they will be unhappy. That's for sure. Maybe we can argue that the percentage of solo stakers marginally will increase, but will it increase long term? I don't believe so, and that's what we show in our paper. And then on staking providers and middleware, this is the more subtle thing. What's the impact? Well, here LSTs and LRTs, they have high costs. And the reason why they have high costs is because they distribute the stake among like 40 node operators. So some of those node operators will drop, and so what the result of this will be just loss of decentralization or reduction decentralization. Centralized exchanges preserve customers and maintain margins because they just have really, really low costs. And CSPs lose customers, but they actually maintain margins probably due to flexible low costs. So they cut on their expenses, on their personnel, and et cetera, and we show in our paper that it is possible, so they will likely maintain their margins. Okay, so what's the upshot? Well, centralized exchange market segment largely untouched. The decentralized market segment of LRT, LST, and CSP feel the pressure, so the issuance cut hits this market segment, and so some stakers and some CSPs leave. And as a result, centralized exchange market share grows, and we end up with less decentralization undermining security. And important thing is that we actually try to model this scenario in a paper. And right now, Coinbase has 15% share, huge unstaked reserves, and ETFs assets are coming. Coinbase is the main custodian for most of the ETF issuers. And so with the issuance cut, we show that with all this information combined, there is a very real scenario of Coinbase achieving 34% of the network. In particular under 40 million stake ETH cap, right? So these kind of these alarms that I'm making that market share decentralization can be lost are very real. And yeah, I encourage everyone to look at our paper and read the analysis. And yeah, so I also wanted to sort of try to apply our framework, this maximum valuable security framework, to some of the arguments that researchers have been discussing. So the first is real versus nominal yield. So one thing that, as a mathematician, I really, appreciate the beauty of that whole argument and construction. But from the practical standpoint, I feel like it's concerns with stakers and not the network, right? Because we're talking about the stakers actually earning less than nominal yield, right? The real yield is less. But in some sense, network doesn't really care about that. Network cares about how many of those stakers we have. So I feel like that argument is a little bit not in the root goal of what we're doing, right? And then current issuance is costly. It's another argument. And we in our paper estimate, and actually Anders also in one of his papers estimates that actually the safe costs from cutting issuance are in single billions, right? So it's about 4, but give or take. And if you think about the market cap of ETH, the trading volume of ETH, it's apparent that this price is relatively low for security assurance that you get from it. So the saving on costs is like on balance is not as valuable as the security and neutrality that Ethereum gets from issuance. And so the last one is boosting monetary hardness of ETH. Well, there's several points here. So first is Bitcoin won that market, right? There's a growing consensus. Bitcoin is a store of value. It's very hard to sort of compete with that. But even more importantly, in my mind, ETH moneyness doesn't really come from hardness of its issuance rate. It actually may decrease if we change the monetary policy because we undermine the credibility, the sustainability of our issuance policy. And also security losses, like if security or neutrality sentiment is suffered, ETH moneyness will suffer for sure because the network and ETH are very, very connected. And then I would even argue that if we want to think about ETH and if we want to think about Ethereum contributors and how we rally around, coordinate and rally the whole community, right? Actually bolstering the network might be the best way to go. Yeah, I know the time's up. I'll speed up in just 1 minute. Yeah, and then there's an attempt, really quickly on relative analysis, right? Here we didn't do. There's almost no analysis out there. I would say that there are arguments pro-cut, there are arguments against cut, but on balance, it feels like aggregating staked ETH on the transparent and smart contract layer, right, that boosts decentralization is better than aggregating it on the opaque TradFi layer with centralized exchanges that undermines neutrality. And I would say that this is also a very important thing that we haven't really done too much research on, but both arguments are security aligned, right? The LST dominance argument and the centralized exchange stake concentration. They're both very important under MVS. Okay, I'll speed up a little bit. So we have lots to do. Let's collaborate. Let's accelerate what we want fiercely. It's an infinite game. There's no end game. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artem. People have questions. Let me start with the first one. Solo stakers have paid most costs upfront, hardware, time to set up, etc. Maintenance is very cheap, but then why do you think staking via CEX centralized exchanges is more inelastic?
Right. So, well, first of all, I would say that there's a misconception that stakers have costs up front, right, and they're fixed costs. They're actually variable costs, and they need to upgrade their setup over time. So one needs to take this into account. Second, solo stakers are people who are very engaged in the community, right, and they are very engaged on chain. They know their options, right, and that's the reason why they are more elastic. It's because centralized exchange users, they don't think about Ethereum. They think about their life, they think about their investments. That's why they're inelastic. Solo stakers, sure. I mean, I admit they have diverse cost preferences. So likely their supply curve is rather steep, at least marginally. But if you think about this fixed costs, you also realize that actually at some point of the yield, it becomes unsustainable. So it's a very important point to dig further, and we did it in our paper. Encourage everyone to read.
Thank you. Just one more time for one question. As more ETH is staked, real profit margins go down, even if you doubled issuance. Why do you think staking margins will not compress either way?
Yeah, so I answered this question on my fourth or fifth slide, is because the market is segmented, right? That's our, let's say, main hope, that decentralization, we can sort of pay this for decentralization is because the other users, other stakers, other capital allocators will be willing to pay higher price with centralized exchange. Is the segmentation of the market. And it really, by the way, it's a fact that it is like that right now. If you just take a look at the fees, 25% fee with Coinbase, and 1 to 10% fees with pools and CSPs. So market is segmented right now. Question, will it be segmented in the long future? I don't know. I would argue that there is a very good chance that it will be segmented. For example, investment, the whole investment market, right? There's pension funds, and then there's professional investment firms. It's a segmented market as well.
Thank you so much. Time is up, Artem. And
Yeah.
thank you for the audience for the questions.
Thank you.
If you have any